Deep in the brainstem, where the oldest parts of the brain press against the top of the spinal cord, a small cluster of neurons sits quiet in the waking hours. Through the day, it waits. Through the evening, it waits. And then, sometime in the night, when sleep has been running long enough, and the architecture of the sleeping brain tips into its stranger phase, that cluster activates, not with a burst, not with a signal that could be felt from the outside, but with a slow, steady, widening release of inhibitory current that begins to move downward through the nervous system like a tide pulling back from a shore. This is the moment REM sleep begins in the brainstem, not in the cortex, where dreaming will eventually be felt as something vivid and strange, but here, in a structure small enough to rest on a fingertip, tucked into the dorsal region of the brainstem, carrying one of the most consequential responsibilities in all of sleep. The structure is called the sublater dorsal nucleus. Most of the time, most people will never know it exists, but every night it performs something close to an act of precise biological grace, sending a wave of suppression along the full length of the spinal cord, so thorough and so careful that by the time it arrives at its destination, the body cannot move at all. The signal does not travel alone. It descends through a relay, passing through the ventromedial medulla, another small region in the lower brainstem, before branching outward into the long pathways that reach the spinal motor neurons, the cells responsible for carrying the brain's movement commands into the muscles. These motor neurons are not passive recipients. Under normal waking conditions, they are held at a potential just below the threshold of firing, responsive to the slightest descending signal, ready to convert thought into action with almost no delay. To paralyze a body that was designed to move, something has to reach those neurons and change the terms of their readiness entirely. What reaches them in REM sleep is chemistry. Two neurotransmitters carry the inhibitory signal that REM atonia depends on. Their names are glycine and GABA, both of them small molecules, both of them well known throughout the nervous system as the principal agents of neural quiet. In the spinal cord during REM sleep, they arrive at the alpha motor neurons in quantities sufficient to hyperpolarize those cells, to push their membrane potential down past the threshold of firing and hold it there steadily for the duration of the REM episode. A hyperpolarized motor neuron cannot fire an action potential. It receives signals from above, signals shaped exactly like movement commands, and those signals arrive and spread across the membrane and dissolve. They produce nothing. The muscle at the end of the line does not contract. The limb does not move. The body lies exactly as it was placed. Along the length of a sleeping body, this chemical suppression is happening simultaneously in thousands of motor neurons at once, each one held just below its threshold, each one receiving the descending inhibitory signal and maintaining its silence. The skeletal muscles, the ones that govern every voluntary movement, every gesture, every word spoken aloud, hang in what can only be called biochemical stillness, as precisely as though each fiber had been individually stilled by the same quiet and unhurried instruction. This is REM, atonia, not the absence of motor drive, but its active, maintained, biochemically enforced suppression, a distinction that matters more than it might first appear. For a long time, the paralysis of REM sleep was understood loosely, assumed to be a passive state, a kind of neural quiet that settled over the motor system when the brain withdrew its attention from movement. The idea was not unreasonable. Sleep looks still from the outside, but the evidence that accumulated in clinical neurology told a more interesting story, and it told it through the patients for whom the atonia mechanism had begun to fail. In REM sleep behavior disorder, the sublaterodorsal nucleus, or its downstream relays, do not maintain the inhibitory signal reliably. The atonia is incomplete, or intermittent, or absent in particular muscle groups. And so what happens is this: the dreaming brain sends its movement signals downward, as it does for everyone, and instead of dissolving at a hyperpolarized motor neuron, those signals arrive at neurons that are available to receive them. The muscles fire, the body moves. A person neurologically asleep, with a dreaming brain, in REM, generating the full electroencephalographic signature of that state, rises, or swings an arm, or speaks, or walks across the room, all in direct enactment of whatever the dreaming cortex is generating in that moment. These movements are not coordinated with the external environment. They correspond to the dream. The sleeper may reach for something that is not there, or defend against something invisible, or carry on a conversation with someone who is not in the room. The body is following instructions from a dreaming mind, because the mechanism that was supposed to keep those instructions from reaching the muscles has quietly failed. What REM sleep behavior disorder demonstrates, with a precision that clinical observation alone could not have manufactured, is that the paralysis of normal REM sleep is not a passive absence. It is an active, maintained, continuously sustained neurological process. The sublaterodorsal nucleus is not resting while the body is still. It is working. Every moment of normal REM atonia is the result of an ongoing inhibitory effort, a continuous signal, a steady chemical suppression, a biological system holding something in check so that the dreaming mind does not express itself physically in the world. When that effort stops, even briefly, the body begins to move. The inverse of sleep paralysis is a dreamer who cannot be still, and the existence of that inverse is one of the clearest pieces of evidence available for understanding what sleep paralysis actually is. In sleep paralysis, something very nearly opposite has occurred. The atonia mechanism has not failed. It has persisted past its proper boundary. The REM episode has ended, or should have ended, but the inhibitory signal from the brainstem has not released. Or the cortex has partially awakened, returned to the electrical signature of waking, begun assembling consciousness and environmental awareness and the sense of being a self in a particular room, while the brainstem, lagging behind, continues to hold its inhibitory signal steady. Two systems that are supposed to move together, that normally transition from REM sleep to waking in a matter of seconds, have come apart. One has moved on, the other has not yet followed. The result is a brain state that is not sleep and is not waking. It is both, simultaneously, and it has a measurable signature. In the sleep laboratory, when researchers have been able to capture sleep paralysis episodes as they happen, which requires patience and careful preparation, since the episodes are difficult to predict and brief when they arrive, the electroencephalogram records something that does not look like any single state. The alpha waves of waking consciousness are present, broad and regular, produced by the cortex as it organizes itself toward awareness. And woven into the same trace are the theta rhythms characteristic of REM sleep, slower and more irregular, produced by the brainstem and limbic structures, still running the machinery of the dream phase. Two electrical signatures, two temporal patterns occurring in the same brain at the same moment. A single EEG trace that contains, without resolving the contradiction, both what waking looks like and what REM looks like, braided together in a record that the machine cannot simplify and the person experiencing it cannot explain. This is the dissociated brain state at the heart of sleep paralysis. Not a failure of the brain in any ordinary sense of the word failure, not a malfunction of the kind that produces disease or lasting harm, but a boundary crossing, a moment when the two systems that govern sleep and waking do not synchronize cleanly, and the result is a condition that is, in strict neurological terms, impossible. A cortex awake and perceiving, a brainstem still running the paralysis of REM, one body containing both. The sublator dorsal nucleus is worth pausing on. It is not a large structure. In an adult human brain, it occupies a volume no bigger than a grain of rice. To locate it, a researcher would need to descend from the cerebral cortex, down through the midbrain, through the upper pons, and into the dorsal region of the brainstem proper. A descent of only a few inches in physical terms, but a journey through hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary history, from the newest and most complex brain structures to some of the oldest. The sublateral dorsal nucleus sits near the floor of the fourth ventricle, a space filled with cerebrospinal fluid, pressed close to the structures that govern breathing and heart rate, and the most basic regulations of the body's interior. It is from this location, ancient, small, central, that the atonia of REM sleep is initiated, and the evidence for its role comes from experiments that could not be conducted in humans directly, but whose results have been precise enough to leave little interpretive ambiguity. In animal models, primarily rodents with neuroanatomy sufficiently similar to allow meaningful comparison, researchers have been able to target the sublateral dorsal nucleus with unusual specificity using two experimental approaches. The first is the targeted lesion study, the selective destruction of tissue in this region, which has been practiced in various forms for decades, and which consistently produces the same result. Animals with lesioned sublateral dorsal nuclei lose the ability to maintain normal REM atonia and exhibit motor behaviors during REM sleep that closely resemble what is observed in human REM sleep behavior disorder. The second approach is newer and more precise. Optogenetics, a technique in which specific neurons are genetically modified to respond to pulses of light, delivered through a fiber optic cable threaded into the brain, allows researchers to turn the sublateral dorsal nucleus on and off with a resolution that lesion studies cannot approach. When optogenetic stimulation activates the sublateral dorsal nucleus during waking, the animal enters something resembling REM atonia. Muscle tone drops, voluntary movement becomes difficult or impossible, the motor system falls silent. When stimulation suppresses the nucleus during REM and sleep, atonia fails immediately and the animal begins to move. The relationship is not correlational, it is causal, direct, and reversible. The sublateral dorsal nucleus is the atonia system's primary activation point. Turn it on, and the body is locked. Turn it off, and the body moves again. From the brainstem of a sleeping animal to the membrane of a motor neuron in the spinal cord, the chain of causation is as close to a closed circuit as neuroscience has been able to construct for any complex behavioral phenomenon. The signal originates in a structure smaller than a rice grain, travels through a relay in the medulla, and arrives at the alpha motor neurons in a chemical form, glycine GABA, that holds those cells below their threshold until the REM episode ends. And then, in the ordinary course of a healthy night of sleep, it ends. The inhibitory signal releases. The membrane potential of the motor neurons rises back toward threshold. Voluntary movement becomes possible again. The body stirs, or shifts, or opens its eyes, and the transition from REM to waking completes itself in a matter of seconds, so smoothly that the person passing through it experiences nothing at all, only the mild blur of waking, the ordinary sense of returning to the room and to the body, the unremarkable fact of being able to move. In sleep paralysis, that moment of release is delayed. The cortex has completed its side of the transition, assembled waking consciousness, oriented itself to the environment, recognized the ceiling above and the pressure of the mattress below, but the brainstem has not released its signal. The motor neurons are still hyperpolarized, the muscles are still silent, and the consciousness that has assembled itself inside this locked body finds in the first moment of its waking awareness that the signal it sends to its hand or its mouth or its eyelids travels downward and arrives nowhere. What it is like to be inside that moment belongs to its own account. The mechanism that produces it is here, in this small and ancient cluster of neurons in the brainstem, and in the chemistry it has dispatched through the spinal cord, and in the hybrid electrical signature visible on an EEG trace when the brainstem and the cortex have gotten out of step with one another. The science of REM and atonia is at its root the science of how the brain manages the extraordinary situation it creates. Every night, a situation in which the mind becomes fully active, generates vivid and emotionally intense experience, rehearses movements and stories and social encounters, while the body must remain entirely still. From the perspective of an organism that sleeps in a world that contains other organisms, many of them dangerous, this is not a trivial problem. A body that enacted every movement its dreaming brain simulated would not survive long in the conditions in which most of animal sleep evolved. On the ground, in the open, undefended. The paralysis of REM and sleep is a solution to a problem the dreaming brain creates. It is a solution so reliable that for most people it completes itself without incident every night of their lives, dozens of times across the years, without ever entering consciousness. The sublater dorsal nucleus activates. Glycine and GABA arrive at the motor neurons and hold them below their threshold. The body lies still while the dreaming cortex moves through whatever it moves through, and then the signal releases and morning comes and none of it left a trace, except in the small proportion of episodes when the release does not come on schedule. The brainstem is not a simple structure. The region that houses the sublater dorsal nucleus contains numerous interacting cell populations, and the transition between REM sleep and waking is not governed by a single switch, but by a balance of competing influences, excitatory signals from the ascending arousal systems, inhibitory signals from structures that maintain sleep, neuromodulatory systems that shift the balance gradually across the night. The flip-flop logic of sleep and waking, in which mutual inhibition between sleep-promoting and wake-promoting regions keeps the brain in one state or the other rather than hovering between them, depends on all of these influences being roughly in balance. When they are not, when the balance tips partially in both directions at once, the result is a boundary state, and sleep paralysis is one of the cleanest and most legible boundary states the human nervous system can produce. Clean and legible because it is not partial in a diffuse way. The cortex is not half awake, it is fully awake, or close enough to make no practical difference. The brainstem is not slightly disinhibited, the atonia is complete. What sleep paralysis presents is not a gradual smearing of one state into another, but a clean dissociation. The cortex on one timetable, the brainstem on another, the two systems running in parallel without synchronizing. And that dissociation is what makes the experience, when it occurs, so difficult to interpret without knowledge of its origin. A consciousness that is fully present and fully rational in a body that is completely unresponsive to its commands has no prior frame for understanding its situation. The gap between what the mind expects of its body and what the body provides is total. In the EEG, that gap has an image: alpha waves for the cortex, theta rhythms for the brainstem, woven into the same half minute of recording, neither yielding to the other. The trace does not resolve. It simply holds both signatures until the atonia releases, and then the theta disappears, and the alpha expands to fill the recording alone, and what was two states becomes one. The alpha waves of waking and the theta rhythms of REM are not simply different speeds of electrical oscillation. They are the signatures of different functional states of the brain, different patterns of communication between different regions, different balances of excitation and inhibition, different global modes of organization. When both are present simultaneously, the brain is not in a mixed state in the way that mixing two colors produces a third. It is in a state of literal dissociation, two modes of organization running in the same organ without integrating. The cortex organizing itself for perception and cognition and environmental awareness. The brainstem maintaining the atonia protocol of REM sleep as though the REM episode had not yet ended, because for the brainstem, it is not. Millimeters separate the cortex from the brainstem in anatomical terms. In functional terms, during sleep paralysis, they are operating on different clocks in the same room, each running its own program, neither aware that the other has changed its schedule. The sublaterodorsal nucleus does not know that the cortex has woken up. It receives no signal telling it that the rest of the brain has moved on. It simply continues doing what it was doing, maintaining the inhibitory signal that REM atonia requires until something in the balance of its own local inputs shifts enough to let the signal go. That shift can come from many directions. A strong arousal signal from the environment, a sound, a touch, can tip the balance. The natural progress of the sleep cycle can tip it, or it tips on its own after a minute or two or three, when the REM mechanism simply runs its course, and the inhibitory drive finally falls below the threshold needed to maintain full atonia, and the motor neurons begin to recover, and the muscles begin to respond, and the paralyzed body moves again, and waking is complete. There is something worth dwelling on in that image. A cluster of neurons in the brainstem, no larger than a grain of rice, holding a chemical signal steady against the pull of a cortex that has already reassembled itself into full waking consciousness, not out of any purpose, not with any awareness of the situation, but simply because the signal has not yet been countered by enough opposing pressure to release. The brainstem does not know it is creating an experience. It does not know there is a consciousness inside the body. It is holding still. It is running its program, and the program is not yet done, and the cortex, fully awake inside that stillness, perceives and reasons and attempts and finds that everything it attempts produces nothing, not because the commands are wrong, not because the muscles are damaged, but because deep in the brainstem, a process that began in REM sleep is still running, and glycine and GABA are still arriving at the motor neurons in the spinal cord, and the membrane potential of each alpha motor neuron is being held just below the line that would allow it to fire. This is not a disorder. There is nothing broken in a brain that produces sleep paralysis. The mechanism is functioning. It is simply not releasing on schedule, in the same way that any tightly regulated biological transition can sometimes lag behind its cue. The atonia system of REM sleep is one of the most elegantly maintained neurological processes in the sleeping body, and sleep paralysis is what it looks like when the cortex gets ahead of it. It looks, from the outside, like a body at rest, perfectly still, breathing in its shallow REM pattern, eyes perhaps moving beneath their lids, the body showing nothing to a room that has no way to know what is happening inside it, the brainstem holding its signal, the cortex wide awake, two systems millimeters apart, briefly out of step, and between them, in the gap their dissociation creates, a consciousness in the strange position of being fully present and completely locked. The study of this state has required patience. Sleep paralysis is not easy to capture in a laboratory because it is brief and unpredictable and must be studied while it is happening, not reconstructed afterward. The polysomnographic records that have been collected, full sleep studies with simultaneous EEG, EMG recordings of muscle tone, respiratory monitoring, and sometimes neuroimaging have confirmed what theory predicted. The hybrid brain state is real and measurable. The cortical arousal is genuine. The brainstem inhibitory tone is maintained. The EEG holds both signatures without resolving them. The atonia is complete, even as the cortex is awake. What the theory described from mechanism has been confirmed by instrument, and the neuroimaging, the functional MRI studies, and PET studies that have examined what the brain is doing during sleep-adjacent states has added a spatial dimension to the electrical picture. Not only are two electrical signatures present simultaneously, but the regional patterns of brain activity during sleep paralysis show features of both waking and REM. The sensory cortices, active and processing, the prefrontal regions engaged, and at the same time, the limbic structures and brainstem regions running patterns more characteristic of the dream state than of ordinary waking. The brain, viewed from the outside through these instruments, looks like two maps overlaid on each other. Neither is wrong, neither is complete. The brain is simply in a state that the maps were not designed to capture, because the state itself is a dissociation between the systems the maps were built to separate. This is what makes sleep paralysis scientifically interesting in ways that extend well beyond its own boundaries. A brain state in which cortical consciousness and brainstem inhibitory control are clearly dissociated, running in parallel, measurably and consistently, is a window into the architecture of sleep and waking that more ordinary transitions do not provide. In a typical morning awakening, the transition from REM to waking takes only seconds and is too smooth and too fast to examine in detail. In sleep paralysis, that transition stalls. The dissociation that is normally too brief to study is held open for 1 minute, 2 minutes, sometimes 3, while instruments can observe it and experiencers can report their internal state from inside it. The boundary between sleep and waking, examined from within, turns out to be not a line, but a region, a territory in which two states can coexist without either fully yielding, in which the machinery of each continues operating on its own schedule, producing a hybrid that is neither and both. The sublater dorsal nucleus sits at the center of this story. Small, ancient, precise, and completely invisible to the person whose body it governs. Every night of sleep, in every person who sleeps normally, it activates and holds and releases. Most of the time, the release comes before the cortex has assembled itself into waking consciousness, and the transition passes unnoticed. Occasionally, rarely for most people, more often for some, the cortex assembles first, and the inhibitory signal holds on. And then the person lying in the dark finds themselves in the strange position of being awake and locked, perceiving the room, knowing the room, reasoning clearly about the room, and unable to move a single voluntary muscle in response to what they perceive. Two systems running in parallel. The brainstem steady at its task, the cortex present and watching, the EEG trace holding both their signatures without resolving the contradiction between them. The atonia will release. It always does. The chemical balance will shift. The inhibitory signal will fall. The motor neurons will recover their threshold, and movement will return. The transition will complete itself, delayed but not denied. The body will be, again, the body the cortex expects it to be, responsive, capable, under voluntary control. But for the duration of the episode, in the quiet of the room and the dark behind the eyes, what exists is something the nervous system was not designed to make available to consciousness, the machinery of its own deepest sleep, running in plain view of a mind awake enough to witness it. The brainstem doing what the brainstem does, holding the muscles of the body below the threshold of movement with a chemical precision that has been maintained across every night of sleep since before the person was old enough to understand what sleep was. And the cortex, resting in the center of that locked and paralyzed body, watching its own architecture at work from the inside, both present, both real, millimeters apart in space, minutes apart in time, and held in that gap by nothing more than the continuing output of a small cluster of neurons that does not yet know the night is over. In the early morning hours, when the night has been long enough that the body's first urgent need for sleep has long since been satisfied, the brain moves through the final and deepest of its REM cycles. The room is dark. The breath is shallow, quick, and regular. Behind closed lids, the eyes trace slow arcs, then faster ones, then still. And somewhere in the progression of that quiet architecture, something does not complete itself in the usual order. The brainstem holds its inhibitory signal, a moment past the point where waking should have gathered its full claim, and consciousness assembles itself inside a body that has not yet received the signal to let go. The first thing that arrives is awareness, not gradually and not with the soft edges of ordinary waking, but with a completeness that is almost administrative. The sense of the room, the weight of the mattress, the particular quality of darkness behind closed eyes, and then the immediate and total knowledge that something is wrong. The arm that should move does not move. The mouth that should open stays precisely where it was. The signal travels from the motor cortex, exact and fully formed, and arrives at muscles that are chemically held at a membrane potential just below the threshold required to produce any contraction at all, and it dissolves there without effect, as completely as a word spoken into a room where no one can hear. This is hypnopompic sleep paralysis. It arrives not at the edge of sleep, but at the edge of waking. The word hypnopompic comes from the Greek for sleep and for the sending away, the moment of being sent out of sleep, and it names the state in which atonia has not yet disengaged at the moment consciousness has already fully returned. It is distinguished from its hypnagogic counterpart, which occurs at sleep onset, typically in people whose REM periods arrive unusually early in the sleep cycle, in states of significant sleep deprivation, or in the neurological condition in which stable sleep stage transitions are difficult to maintain. Hypnopompic episodes are the more common form in the general population, and they arise from the most reliable mechanism, a morning REM period running its full depth while waking tiptoes back in through the cortex, and the two states occupying the same body at exactly the same moment. The chest is the first place the stillness becomes loud. In ordinary breathing, the intercostal muscles, the thin ribbons of muscle threaded between each rib, respond to the lightest respiratory signal, expanding the rib cage in a rhythm so practiced and so automatic that it requires no attention at all. But during REM sleep, those muscles, like virtually every other skeletal muscle in the body, fall under the same inhibitory hold. The atonia that silences the limbs silences the respiratory accessory muscles as well. The diaphragm continues working. It is the one muscle that is largely exempt from full atonia, because breathing is too fundamental to be stopped, but the rib cage does not expand with its usual ease. The breath is shallower than it is awake. The rhythm is different, and in the blood, carbon dioxide builds very slightly. not to dangerous levels, but enough to carry a signal through the brainstem to the brain's threat detection machinery. Something is not right about the way the air is moving in and out. The desire to breathe more deeply arrives like an instruction that the body refuses to execute. The effort is there, the intention is there, and the rib cage holds its position with the same quiet authority as the arm, the leg, and the jaw. This combination, the chemical accumulation of carbon dioxide, the atonic rib cage, and the weight of gravity pressing on a supine chest, produces what people most consistently remember about episodes of sleep paralysis, more consistently even than any visual content: the sensation of pressure, of something heavy resting where the lungs need to expand. The weight is not imaginary, in the sense that the signals producing it are real physiological events. The brainstem is reporting accurately that the breath is restricted. The threat detection system is reading that report correctly. What it cannot know is that the restriction is temporary, chemical, and entirely without danger, because the system that normally interprets restriction in the chest has no subroutine for a situation in which the body is fine and simply waiting to unlock. So the pressure sits, and the consciousness that perceives it is fully intact. This is one of the most precise and reliable facts about sleep paralysis, and also one of the strangest, that the mind inside the frozen body is not confused, not half awake, not drifting. Working memory is intact. The reasoning that locates the body in its familiar room is accurate. The awareness of lying in a specific position on a specific surface, of the time of morning, of the state of being in a known and safe place, is all present and functional. A person experiencing sleep paralysis can think with complete clarity about what is happening to them. They can remember who they are, where they are, and what sleep paralysis is if they have experienced it before. They can form intentions, the intention to call out, to move a finger, to blink, and they can observe those intentions travel nowhere with the detached precision of a scientist watching an experiment that is not producing the expected result. The finger is the place people most often try first. It is a small ambition, not the arm, not the shoulder, just the smallest finger, moved 1/4 of an inch. The signal that would accomplish this originates in the primary motor cortex, passes down through the corticospinal tract, reaches the anterior horn of the spinal cord, and arrives at the alpha motor neurons, whose job it is to translate neural command into muscular contraction. Those neurons are held at a membrane voltage just below firing threshold by the steady presence of glycine and GABA, the two inhibitory neurotransmitters whose work keeps the sleeping body still during the dreaming brain's most active hours. The signal from the cortex is real, the pathway is open, and at the last junction, in the quiet cellular architecture of the spinal cord, the command meets a chemical hold that it cannot overcome, and nothing moves. The finger stays still, and the consciousness that tried to move it registers this with full, clear awareness, not as confusion, not as a dream, but as a fact about the present moment, as plain as the darkness behind the eyes. What makes this stillness so different from ordinary sleep is that in ordinary sleep, there is no observer. The atonia of REM sleep does not feel like anything to the person sleeping through it, because the cortical systems that would generate that feeling are themselves submerged in the dream state. The atonia of sleep paralysis feels like precisely what it is: the absence of voluntary movement in a body that is consciously trying to produce it, because the cortex has already woken and has gone looking for a body that has not yet followed. The two states, brainstem inhibition and cortical wakefulness, run simultaneously, not in sequence as they normally would, and between them they produce a condition that has no ordinary name, because it does not ordinarily occur. A mind fully present inside a body it cannot reach. The breath continues in its shallow rhythm. The room holds its specific darkness, and the consciousness inside the stillness does what consciousness does. It begins to measure the situation it finds itself in. Time behaves strangely in this state, as it does in most states where attention has nothing to do but attend, because there is no movement, no transition, no progression of events. The brain has very little to use as a temporal marker. Seconds accumulate without landmarks. The minute that passes may feel like 5. The 3 minutes that pass, which is the approximate duration of the majority of episodes, resolved by the natural disengagement of the atonia mechanism as the brain's state balance tips fully toward wakefulness, may feel considerably longer, not because the perception of time is distorted in any measurable way, but because time, when there is nothing happening inside it, opens up into a kind of suspension that has the quality of being both very brief and very long at once, without resolving into either. The stillness during that time is absolute in a way that stillness in ordinary waking never quite is. In ordinary waking, the body is always doing something, shifting, adjusting, the small postural corrections that happen entirely without thought. Even in the most relaxed sitting or lying position, there are micro adjustments, tiny movements of weight and breath that the motor system manages without any conscious instruction. In sleep paralysis, all of that is gone. The body on the mattress is as still as it has ever been while conscious. The stillness is not uncomfortable in itself, but in combination with the intact awareness that is trying to reach it, the stillness becomes a kind of absence, a silence where there is usually a conversation between mind and body that is so constant it is normally never noticed. People who have experienced multiple episodes of sleep paralysis describe this absence in similar terms across many different accounts. The sensation that the body has become very far away, the sense of being located somewhere slightly above or behind the position the body actually occupies, not dramatically displaced, as in certain hallucinatory experiences, but simply unanchored in a way that is different from ordinary embodied feeling. This is not a hallucination. Technically, it falls short of the complete spatial displacement that some episodes include, and the body's actual position is never genuinely mistaken. It is something subtler, the feeling that the relationship between the observing consciousness and the physical body has become abstract, because the ordinary proof of that relationship, the body's response to intention, is absent. Some external events can interrupt this state, not reliably and not always, but with enough frequency that people who experience recurrent sleep paralysis sometimes instruct their partners to touch them if they seem not to be waking properly in the morning. A touch, a hand on the arm, a gentle shaking can deliver an arousal signal strong enough to tip the brain's balance out of the hybrid REM-wake state and into full wakefulness. The touch doesn't unlock the body through any direct mechanical action. What it does is carry sensory information through pathways that are still functional. The somatosensory system does not shut down during REM atonia the way the motor system does, and that information, arriving in a brain that is already partially aroused, can provide the additional input needed to tip the atonia mechanism into full disengagement. A loud sound can sometimes accomplish the same thing. The arousal threshold is not infinitely high. It is simply higher than the signals that arise naturally from inside the paralyzed state, from the intention to move, from the desire to speak, from the pressure and the stillness and the waiting. Without external intervention, The resolution comes from inside the system. The brainstem's atonia mechanism, like all mechanisms of REM sleep, has a natural time course. As the REM episode moves toward its end, as the state balance shifts, the inhibitory signal that has been holding the motor neurons below their firing threshold begins to ease. This is not an abrupt event. It happens gradually. At the level of the cell membrane, the chemical concentration of glycine and GABA declining at the synapses until the motor neurons recover their excitability. What the person inside the paralysis experiences is something that feels far less gradual. Because the body has been completely still, there is no graduated series of small movements marking the return of motor function. There is typically a threshold event, the first movement, which arrives as a muscular jerk or a sudden flooding of sensation back into the limbs, like the return of circulation to a part of the body that has been compressed. One instant, the arm is a stone. The next instant it moves, and in moving it reports back to the cortex with the urgency of a circuit that has been closed after a long hold. People describe this moment as a sudden unlocking, a rush, a snap back into the body that is physically felt, not painful, but present in a way that has the quality of relief, even when the episode itself was not especially frightening. After the movement comes, the full transition into waking usually follows quickly. The eyes open if they were not already open. The rib cage expands with the first voluntary deep breath, and the carbon dioxide that has been building in the blood begins to clear. The room reassembles itself in ordinary daylight or morning dark. The heart, which may have been running faster through the episode, not through any direct effect of the atonia, but through the autonomic activation that accompanies the hybrid state, begins to slow. The body has been still for perhaps 2 minutes, perhaps 3, perhaps slightly less, and the person lying in it has been fully present for all of it. Rexatificates befernal. This intact consciousness, the awareness that does not go away, that witnesses the entire duration of the episode with complete lucidity, is what gives sleep paralysis its particular quality among unusual sleep states. Dreams are not like this. In the ordinary dream, the dreaming mind accepts its own content, builds its own logic, and does not stand at a reliable distance from its own experience, asking careful questions. The person in a vivid dream believes they are swimming or running or speaking to someone long absent, and the belief is total while the dream continues. The knowledge that one is dreaming, if it comes at all, requires a specific cognitive shift that most people rarely make. Sleep paralysis involves no such suspension. The consciousness inside a sleep paralysis episode is not dreaming and does not believe it is. It knows where it is. It knows what time it is, approximately. It knows its own name and its own history and the specific geography of the room around it. It can track the ceiling above with perceptual clarity, noting the particular texture of the plaster, the place where the curtain ends and the pale rectangle of morning begins, the position of the doorframe in the near dark. All of this visual information, where it is available, is accurate. The perception is not distorted in the way dream perception is distorted. The room is the room, and the hand at the side, resting against the mattress, is as unresponsive as stone. This combination, the precisely accurate external perception, the intact reasoning, and the complete motor paralysis, is not common in human experience. Most states that produce motor silence produce equivalent perceptual reduction. The deeply anesthetized person cannot move, but they also cannot track the ceiling. The person in dreamless slow-wave sleep cannot move because there is no wakeful consciousness present to attempt movement. Sleep paralysis stands almost alone as a state in which the perceptual and cognitive systems run at full waking capacity, while the motor system is completely suspended, and this is what makes it so particularly striking to those who experience it, not the paralysis alone, which would simply be frightening, and not the consciousness alone, which is simply ordinary waking, but the coexistence of the two in a single body at the same moment. From the outside, the person in sleep paralysis is indistinguishable from any sleeping person, still, breathing, eyes open or closed. There is nothing to observe. The experience is entirely interior. The polysomnograph, if one were attached, would tell a different story. 3G channels carrying the theta rhythm associated with REM sleep, alongside the alpha waves of waking, the two electrical signatures overlapping in a single trace in a way that would not be expected in any normal sleep stage or ordinary wakefulness. The brainstem drives one signature, the cortex drives the other. Neither yields completely to the other, and between them they hold the body in a state that is technically neither fully asleep nor fully awake, but that contains the most consequential elements of each. The theta waves come from the brainstem's REM generating circuits, still running their program, still sending the signals that maintain atonia and sustain the dream state activation that the brain uses to process emotional memory and integrate the experiences of the previous day. The alpha waves come from the cortex, which has reached its waking threshold through whatever combination of circadian timing, noise, light, or internal arousal lifted it there, and which is now doing what it always does when awake, perceiving, reasoning, holding the immediate present in working memory, and trying, at intervals, to move the arm. For the duration of the episode, these two streams of electrical activity coexist. The EEG trace that records them looks to a trained eye like a record of someone who is simultaneously two things, not confused between them, but genuinely both. The brainstem has not received the signal to end its REM program. The cortex has not received the signal that movement is unavailable and drifted back into dreaming. Neither system is malfunctioning. Both are doing exactly what they do at exactly the time they are doing it. The malfunction, if that word applies, is only in the timing. The normal tight sequencing that keeps these states separated has come slightly apart at the seam, and the brief gap between them is the space where sleep paralysis lives. As the minutes pass and the atonia mechanism continues toward its natural disengagement, the EEG trace begins to shift. The theta component fades. The alpha component becomes dominant. The motor neurons in the spinal cord, their inhibitory hold beginning to ease, approach their firing threshold. The tip point comes, not visible in the trace, but felt from the inside as that sudden jerk, that rush of returning function, and in the moment after it, the two streams of activity separate cleanly. Waking takes its full claim. What is left in the ordinary light of the waking morning is the memory of having been present for all of it, not the dim, dissolving memory of a dream, which retreats even as the eyes open and is often gone by the time the first cup of tea is made. The memory of sleep paralysis is ordinary waking memory, stored by the hippocampus and subject to the same processes of consolidation and recall as any other fully conscious experience, because that is what it was, a fully conscious experience, because that is what it was, a fully conscious experience, because that is what it was, a fully conscious experience, because that is what it was, a fully conscious experience, because that is what it was, a fully conscious experience, because that is what it was, a fully conscious experience, because that is what it was, a fully conscious experience, because that is what it was, a fully conscious as unambiguously waking in its cognitive substrate as any other moment of the morning. This is why sleep paralysis is remembered so consistently and described so precisely by people who experience it. The duration is remembered accurately. The sequence of events is remembered accurately. The specific sensory details, the exact quality of the chest pressure, the precise appearance of the ceiling, the specific location of the body in the room, are available for recall with the fidelity of any ordinary waking memory. Dreams are generally not remembered this way. They are reconstructed from fragments, subject to rapid decay, and often changed slightly each time they are accessed. Sleep paralysis memories do not decay in the same way because they were formed by a fully waking cortex under ordinary consolidation conditions, and they persist accordingly. People who experience recurring episodes often develop a familiarity with the state that changes their experience of subsequent episodes. The first episode, arriving without any prior frame, carries with it the full force of the inexplicable, a waking consciousness in a frozen body, with no available explanation for the gap between intention and movement. Subsequent episodes, experienced by a person who now has context for what is happening, often carry a different quality. There is still the stillness, there is still the pressure, but alongside them there is recognition, the knowledge that this is a known state with a known duration and a known resolution, and that recognition changes the experience of the waiting, if not the waiting itself. Some people learn to wait with a kind of attentive calm, observing the state from inside it, noting its features, tracking the gradual drift back toward the tip point. Others find that even with full knowledge of what is happening, the pressure and the paralysis are hard to hold quietly, and the minutes feel long. The experience is not the same for everyone who enters it, even on separate occasions for the same person. What remains constant is the clarity of the consciousness inside it, the intact reasoning, the accurate perception, the lucid presence in a body that has temporarily become unreachable. There is something in this that has no precise parallel in the rest of waking life. Most of human experience is built on the assumption that the mind and the body move together, that the intention to reach is followed by the reach, that the decision to speak is followed by speech, that the relationship between will and action is so immediate and so reliable that it ordinarily requires no attention at all. The body is simply there, continuous and responsive, the transparent medium through which the mind meets the world. Sleep paralysis removes that transparency, not gently, not gradually, but completely and immediately, and in doing so, it makes visible a relationship that is otherwise never seen, because it is never interrupted. The arm that does not move, at the moment it is commanded, is the most complete possible demonstration of how separate those two things actually are, the consciousness that intends and the body that performs, and of how thoroughly the link between them depends on a system that runs automatically and silently and almost always correctly. When it runs correctly, the link is invisible. When it pauses at the edge between sleep and waking, in the brief gap where the brainstem holds its signal, past the moment when the cortex has already woken, the link becomes visible for the first time. And what is visible is not a failure, exactly, but a seam, the place where two systems that are always running in parallel allow for a few minutes in the early morning light, the gap between them to be felt. The breath continues in its shallow rhythm. The room holds its familiar geometry in the dark. The hand at the side stays still, and still and still, while inside the body that contains it, a mind that is fully and unambiguously present, waits with complete lucidity for the moment when everything will simply and quietly unlock. And then it does. The jerk arrives. The rib cage expands with the first free breath. The fingers close and open on the sheet. The room comes back in its ordinary way, ordinary and immediate, and lit now by whatever thin morning has found its way around the curtain's edge. The consciousness that was there through all of it, that tracked the ceiling, measured the stillness, tried the finger, waited, is the same consciousness that reaches now for the first voluntary movement of the morning. There is no gap between the two. The witness inside the paralysis and the person waking into the ordinary day are continuous because they were never separate. Only the body had gone somewhere else for a little while. Only the body, held at its atonic depth by the quiet chemistry of a brainstem still running its nighttime program, had been briefly, completely, and then no longer unreachable. The memory of it will still be there at noon. It will still be there a week from now, clear and detailed and fully formed, stored with the same fidelity as any other waking moment, because that is exactly what it was, a waking moment, lived inside a body that was, for those few quiet and particular minutes, somewhere in the deep and systematic stillness between sleep and the morning, still and fully present and waiting to be found. In the sleep laboratory, the EEG trace moves across the screen in slow, familiar waves. The room is dim and close. Behind a pane of glass, on the other side of a wall, thin enough to whisper through, a person lies on a narrow bed in the dark, electrodes tracing from scalp and chin and chest to the machine that reads them, and the machine draws its steady picture of a brain caught between two states at once. The amygdala activates first, not with a click or a visible change, nothing the person on the bed would recognize as a distinct event, but deep in the temporal lobe, where threat is processed and fear is organized into response, a cluster of cells that has been burning at the low, sustained intensity of REM sleep suddenly carries that intensity forward into something that is no longer quite REM. The cortex above it is waking. Its electrical signature is shifting from the mixed slow rhythms of dreaming toward the faster, more coherent waves of a mind assembling itself into awareness. But the amygdala has not followed. It remains at its REM level pitch, processing with the urgency the dreaming brain reserves for emotionally charged content, reading the novel situation of partial wakefulness with the same circuits it uses to read genuine threat. What arrives in that moment is not an image, it is a quality, a change in the felt texture of the room's space. The air in the room is the same. The ceiling above is unchanged, pale and flat and ordinary. The sound of a distant hallway, the low hum of the building's systems, the patient rhythm of the person's own breath, none of these has altered, and yet something in the room has shifted in a way that cannot be pointed to, cannot be named by any sensor, because it exists entirely inside the nervous system of the person on the bed. It arrives as a directional weight, an orientation of attention toward the far side of the room, toward the doorway, or the corner, or the place just at the edge of peripheral vision. It arrives as a certainty that something has entered, or has been here all along, and has only now made itself felt. This is the intruder hallucination. It comes not as a figure, but as a fact. The threat detection circuitry of the brain, which ordinarily scans the world for agents, for things with intention, for presences that move and want and act, does not stop operating at the edges of normal sleep. In REM sleep, these systems run at elevated intensity, processing the emotionally charged content of dreams with a vigilance calibrated to survival. The amygdala is particularly active during REM, reading social cues and threat signals at a level that would, in waking life, constitute mild hyperarousal. When REM bleeds forward into the waking state, this amygdala tone comes with it, arriving into a cortex that is now awake enough to perceive its environment, but still running on the emotional architecture of the dreaming brain. The agent detection system has a well-documented bias. It tilts toward false positives across the long history of the nervous system. Missing the presence of a predator has always cost more than perceiving one that was not there. So the system errs in one direction, always toward detection. It pattern completes. From incomplete sensory information, from silence, from darkness, from the slight unease of waking in an unfamiliar body state, it assembles a presence, not a hallucination in the colloquial sense of something vivid and visual appearing in the field of vision, but a hallucination in the more fundamental sense, a perception constructed by the brain and projected into the world, carrying the full convincing weight of something real. Researcher Balin Jalal has proposed that what the intruder hallucination represents is precisely this: the brain's threat anticipation system, running at RM level intensity, filling the ambiguous dark with an agent because that is what it is built to do. The agent has no face yet. It has no movement the eyes can track, but it has presence and intention, and it occupies the space of the room with the same certainty that the ceiling and the walls and the motionless body on the bed occupy it. The body on the bed cannot move. This is the condition in which the intruder hallucination arrives, into a consciousness that is awake enough to perceive and reason and remember, but locked inside a body that will not respond to any command the waking mind can form. The brainstem's inhibitory signal, the same chemical suppression that prevents the dreaming body from acting out its dreams, has not released. Glycine and GABA hold the alpha motor neurons of the spinal cord just below the threshold of firing. The cortex sends its signals, the brain's motor regions issue their commands, and the commands dissolve at the border of the brainstem without ever becoming movement. The hand that should reach out, the mouth that should call for help, the legs that should carry the body upright, and out of this state, none of them receives what is sent. The threat detection system reads this too. It reads the helplessness, and it responds with the appropriate emotion, the one calibrated to threat combined with immobility, not merely fear, but the particular escalating quality of fear that arises when there is no available action. The amygdala's signal cascades outward through its downstream projections, through the hypothalamus and the brainstem nuclei that govern physiological arousal, flooding the body with the chemistry of acute danger. Heart rate rises, the breath shortens, the skin prickles with the ghost of a response that in any other circumstance would be the beginning of flight. But the body cannot flee. The muscles that would carry it away are under the same inhibitory command as all the others, and the fear that has nowhere to go simply accumulates, building pressure inside a system that cannot release it through action. And into this charged and helpless state, the incubus arrives. The weight comes first, most often, a pressure on the chest that is not imagined but physiologically real in its origins, arising from the atonic intercostal muscles that cannot contribute their normal force to the act of breathing, from the mild accumulation of carbon dioxide that comes with the shallow, passive respiratory mechanics of REM sleep, from the gravitational load of the rib cage resting against itself without the tone to manage it. The body on the bed feels pressed down, flattened, held, and the brain, presented with a sensation of inexplicable weight on the chest in a room where a presence has already been detected, performs the act it performs most fluently and most automatically. It constructs a cause. The incubus hallucination is the brain's causal story. Something is sitting here, Something with weight and intent has placed itself on this chest and is preventing the ordinary act of breathing more deeply. The story is assembled from the same materials the brain uses to construct all of its narratives: memory, expectation, the stored template of what a pressing, threatening agent looks and feels like, and it is assembled with extraordinary speed and conviction because the amygdala is demanding an explanation and the default mode network is providing one. The default mode network is a distributed constellation of brain regions that activates most strongly when the mind turns inward. The medial prefrontal cortex, which processes self-relevant information and social meaning. The posterior cingulate cortex, which integrates memory and spatial orientation into a coherent sense of where and who one is. The angular gyrus, which binds together the body's felt position with the larger spatial world around it. In waking life, these regions sustain the continuous low-level narrative of selfhood, the ongoing story of who is here, what this situation means, and what others in it might intend. In REM sleep, they contribute to the construction of dream narratives, organizing fragments of memory and emotion into scenes with characters and consequence. During sleep paralysis, the default mode network is active in both modes at once. The person on the bed is awake enough that their self-model is intact. They know their name, they know where they are, they can think in consecutive sentences and reach for rational interpretations of what is happening. And yet the dreaming architecture is also running, and into the self-model's awareness, it is delivering content assembled from the REM brain stores, threatening agents with apparent intention, physical sensations interpreted through social and narrative templates, presences that arrive not as hallucinations of light or sound, but as socially structured experiences with all the implied meaning of an encounter between minds. This is why the incubus has intent. This is why the presence at the doorway seems to want something. The default mode network does not generate noise or abstraction. It generates narrative, and narrative requires agents with purposes. The social processing regions that give the dreaming brain its ability to model other minds, to imagine what another person is thinking, to feel the weight of being watched, are running without the corrective feedback of actually being in a social situation. There is no other person. There is no figure at the threshold. But the brain is generating one anyway, from its own deep knowledge of what presences are and how they behave, and it is projecting that generated entity into the real perceived geometry of a familiar room. The room the hallucination inhabits is not vague or dreamlike in its features. This is one of the qualities that make sleep paralysis hallucinations so particularly vivid and disturbing compared to ordinary dreams. The environment is correct, the ceiling is the right ceiling, the door is where the door has always been. The streetlight that falls through the window in a long angle across the floor is at exactly the angle it is always at during the hours before morning. The waking brain perceives the room accurately, with full sensory fidelity, and into that accurate environment, the dreaming brain inserts its generated content. The intruder stands in the real room. The incubus sits on the real chest. The meeting place of the two states is the actual, ordinary bedroom, which is why the experience carries none of the ready-made narrative distance of a dream, recognized as such. In the sleep laboratory, the EEG trace for the person on the narrow bed is drawing two pictures at once. The faster, flatter waves of cortical wakefulness run across the trace alongside the slower, more irregular rhythms of REM activation. They are not separate and alternating. They are simultaneous, woven together in a single electrical record, two states occupying the same brain at the same moment. alpha waves from the cortex, which normally signify relaxed wakefulness with the eyes closed. Theta rhythms from deeper regions, the signature of the dreaming brain, carrying its activation forward into a state that was supposed to have finished. The polysomnographic record captures something that has no ordinary name because it has no ordinary state, a brain neither asleep nor awake, but holding both conditions in a single, unstable suspension. The amygdala within that suspended brain is still reading threat. It cannot do otherwise. The situation is genuinely novel, a conscious, reasoning mind trapped inside a body it cannot move, with a felt presence in the room, and a weight on the chest, and no available action. And novelty in ambiguous circumstances is precisely the kind of input that the amygdala processes by elevating its threat signal. The hyperactivation that is normal and functional during REM sleep, where the amygdala tags dream content for emotional processing and memory consolidation, here finds a different application. It amplifies, it sustains. And because the state is a hybrid one, in which neither full sleep nor full wakefulness can resolve the situation, the amygdala's signal does not decay in the way it would if the person were fully awake and able to look around and confirm there is nothing there. The body cannot confirm. The body cannot do anything. And so the amygdala continues. The fear accumulates without movement, without release, without the action that would in any normal encounter begin to discharge it. Somewhere in the accumulated fear, the vestibular nuclei are still working. Small structures set in the brainstem. The vestibular nuclei receive signals from the inner ear about the body's position and movement in space, and they generate the sense of orientation, up, down, tilted, spinning, falling, that tells the body where it is relative to the world. During REM sleep, these nuclei remain active. They continue generating movement signals as part of the dreaming brain's simulation of embodied experience, producing the felt sensations of running and flying and falling that populate the dream body's life. When REM activation carries forward into the paralyzed waking state, the vestibular nuclei carry forward too. The body on the bed has not moved. Its weight is exactly where it was. Every physical sensor in the environment, the pressure of the mattress beneath the shoulders, the pull of gravity on the still limbs, the fixed angle of the streetlight through the window, confirms that nothing is in motion. And yet the vestibular nuclei are generating sensations of movement that the conscious mind receives as real, floating, most often, the distinct felt upward drifting of the body away from the bed, a buoyancy that arrives without cause and moves without direction, or spinning, a slow clockwise revolution of the entire felt self, while the visual field of the ceiling stays exactly where it has always been, or being dragged, pulled laterally across the bed's surface toward a wall or a window, the sensation so specific and so physically convincing that the person experiencing it may reach the same certainty about its reality that they would reach about any genuine movement. These vestibular motor hallucinations are the neurological substrate of something much older than sleep laboratories. The sensation of leaving the body, of rising above it and looking down at the still form on the bed, of floating through a room or out through a ceiling into a place that has neither walls nor gravity. These experiences, reported across cultures and across centuries as journeys of the spirit or visions of the soul departing the body, arise from precisely the same mechanisms. The vestibular nuclei continuing to generate movement in a body, the brainstem's inhibitory signal has locked completely still. The discrepancy between felt movement and physical stillness, between the self that is floating and the self that is plainly lying on a mattress, is resolved by a brain already running at REM level intensity in a simple and elegant way. If the felt self is moving, but the visible body is not, then the felt self must have separated from the body. The conclusion is not a mistake or a delusion. It is the most coherent narrative interpretation available to a brain that is simultaneously receiving incompatible streams of sensory information. The out-of-body experience is the brain solving a problem, and it solves it exactly the way the brain solves all problems, by constructing the most internally consistent explanation for the available evidence, drawing on stored cultural and experiential templates to give the explanation its specific shape. The default mode network gives the shape. From the medial prefrontal cortex come the self-referential coordinates. This is happening to me. This is my perspective looking down. From the posterior cingulate cortex come the spatial memories. This is my room. That still form below is what my body looks like from above. From the angular gyrus, which integrates bodily self-location with the wider spatial environment, comes the coherent geometry of a self that has a position in space and is in a different position than the body it just left. The experience is not fragmentary or confused. It is spatially detailed, spatially consistent, and phenomenologically convincing in a way that has led many people who encounter it to conclude, often with great conviction and long afterward, that what they experienced was real in a sense that could not be neurological. The neurological account does not diminish the reality of the experience. The person who floated above the bed felt exactly what they remember feeling. The vestibular nuclei sent their signals, the default mode network assembled its narrative, and the result was an experience of consciousness departing the body that was as fully present, as textured, as spatially coherent as any experience waking life produces. That the mechanism can be traced does not make the experience smaller. It makes the brain larger, or at least stranger, and more capacious than ordinary description suggests. Back in the sleep laboratory, the person on the narrow bed is still lying still. The EEG continues its double drawing, alpha and theta wound together in the same trace. The amygdala continues at its REM pitch. The vestibular nuclei are still generating their signals of motion for a body that is not moving. The incubus on the chest, the weight, the pressure, the sense of a situated and intentional presence remains. And then the default mode network continues its construction, reaching deeper into its stores. The figures that the dreaming brain generates during sleep paralysis are not random. They are not, in the main, abstract shapes or formless darknesses. They are social agents, entities with bodies, or at least with the felt properties of bodies: weight, direction, presence, apparent intent. They look human, often, or human adjacent, in the same way that the figures who populate ordinary dreams look human. The social processing regions of the cortex have been learning about other minds for as long as the person has been alive, cataloging the cues of attention and intention and emotional state that allow one mind to model another. During sleep paralysis, those regions are running, and into the constructed scene of the real bedroom, they deliver what they know best. The figure in the doorway has not moved, but it feels as though it is watching. The specific quality of being watched, the felt shift in attention from a room that contains no observers to a room that contains one, is something the brain tracks with extraordinary sensitivity in waking life, because being watched by something with intentions is exactly the kind of information that warrants physiological response. The same circuits that detect the gaze of another person, that generate the involuntary response to eyes turned in one's direction, are now running on internally generated input. There is no figure, there are no eyes, but the circuitry that would respond to them is producing the response anyway, and into the charged space of the paralyzed brain's awareness, the response arrives as fact. Something is looking. The amygdala receives this too. Its threat signal rises again. There is a particular quality to the panic that builds in sleep paralysis that distinguishes it from ordinary fear, and the distinction is physiological rather than merely psychological. In ordinary fear, the physiological arousal that the amygdala produces, the elevated heart rate, the heightened alertness, the tension in the muscles ready for action, is functionally linked to the possibility of action. The fear is coupled to a response. It is, in the body's terms, productive. The chemistry of threat mobilizes the body toward escape or defense. During sleep paralysis, the same chemistry is produced in exactly the same cascade, but the coupling to action has been severed. The brainstem's inhibitory signal holds the motor neurons at rest, regardless of what the amygdala sends, regardless of how high the arousal climbs. The muscles remain biochemically silenced. The heart beats faster and has nowhere to go with it. The breath shortens and cannot deepen. The fear that ordinarily resolves itself through movement accumulates instead, cycling through the amygdala's threat circuitry without diminishment, because the feedback that would diminish it, the actual beginning of escape, the felt sensation of the body moving toward safety, never arrives. This is why sleep paralysis is reported as one of the most acutely terrifying experiences a person can undergo while remaining in their own ordinary bedroom. The terror is not a measure of irrationality or of the hallucination's actual danger. It is a measure of the disconnect between the emotional chemistry of the waking amygdala and the inescapable biochemical stillness of the sleeping brainstems hold on the body's muscles. The fear is real. The mechanism producing it is real. The experience is genuinely distressing, not because anything dangerous is present, but because the brain's threat system is running at high intensity inside a body it cannot mobilize, and the experience of that gap between urgent fear and total physical helplessness has a quality that no description quite reaches. The person on the bed knows this is not real, or they suspect it, or they hold both at once. The rational mind that can name what is happening, and the amygdala-driven conviction that something is here, that the weight is genuine, that the presence in the corner of the room is as present as the ceiling. Sleep paralysis is one of the very few human experiences in which these two modes, rational, intact, working cognition, and emotional, hallucinatory, threat-driven conviction, run simultaneously without either resolving into the other. The reasoning mind does not dismiss the presence, because the felt quality of the presence is too convincing, too specific, too thoroughly lodged in the actual perceived room. And the emotional mind does not drown the reasoning mind, because the cortex is genuinely awake, genuinely capable of remembering that this has happened before, genuinely able to form the thought, this is sleep paralysis, it will end. Both thoughts inhabit the same brain. Neither wins. They exist in the same suspension as the alpha and theta waves on the EEG trace, each one fully present, neither one completing its ordinary resolution into the state it belongs to. The default mode network continues assembling its figure from memory, from every representation of a threatening agent the brain has ever stored, from stories heard and images seen and fears held in the body for years. It draws the specific character of what is here. The figure in the doorway gains weight in the mind's model, not visual weight, necessarily. The intruder hallucination is not always seen, and when it is rarely with the crisp detail of the ceiling or the wall. It is felt, mostly, felt with a specificity and a conviction that the visual system's contribution, when it comes at all, only confirms. The brain is working from the inside out, and what it generates carries the authority of experience rather than the tentativeness of inference. The posterior cingulate cortex orients the experience spatially. The angular gyrus places the self within it. The medial prefrontal cortex gives the generated agent its apparent inner life, its intentions, its focus, its seeming awareness of the person lying paralyzed on the bed. These are not separate contributions processed sequentially. They arrive together as experience arrives, all at once, and already integrated, already a scene with a dreamer at its center and something at its edge that is turning slowly toward them. The clock on the wall, if there is one, shows a time that is close to dawn. Sleep paralysis is most common in the final hours of the night, during the last REM cycle of the night's architecture, when REM periods are longest and most intense, and the body's sleep pressure has been substantially satisfied. Satisfied enough that the brain hovers at the surface of waking rather than staying submerged in sleep. This proximity to waking is both the cause and the condition. The brain is close enough to consciousness that the cortex can assemble itself, and it is close enough that the atonia system has not yet disengaged, because the REM period that produced the atonia is still running in the brainstem, still sending its inhibitory signal, still holding the motor neurons just below the threshold of fire. Two clocks are running in the same brain. The cortex's clock is pulling toward waking, toward the ordinary morning assembly of the self in a body ready for the day. The brainstem's clock is running on REM time, committed to the inhibitory program it began when REM sleep started, not yet receiving the signal that would release it. The gap between those two clocks is the duration of the episode. It is measured in most cases in minutes, 1, 2, 3, rarely more. But inside the episode, with the amygdala at its REM level intensity and the vestibular nuclei generating their signals of impossible motion, and the default mode network assembling its figure from the dark, the gap is not experienced as minutes. It is experienced as long enough. The weight on the chest is a pressure with a story. The story has a character. The character has turned from the doorway and is moving across the real floor of the real room toward the person who cannot lift a hand to stop what is coming. The brainstem's inhibitory signal does not know this. The glycine and GABA at the spinal motor neurons do not know this. The biochemical silence of the skeletal muscles continues exactly as it began, at exactly the level the REM onset atonia mechanism established, unchanged by fear or by the elaborate narrative that fear has generated above it. In the angular gyrus, the bodily self and the spatial world are held in relation. In the posterior cingulate cortex, memory and place are woven together into a scene that is continuous with the past and the future. In the medial prefrontal cortex, the social story is sustained, refined, made coherent with each passing second. And in the amygdala, the threat signal burns at the intensity of genuine danger, informing every other system that this moment requires response, that the situation is acute, that waiting is not a strategy. The body waits. The brainstem continues its signal. The vestibular nuclei send their messages of motion to a body that is still. The EEG trace in the sleep laboratory draws its double picture. Waking and dreaming wound together, neither resolving into the other, both fully present in a single brain held at the exact threshold between two states. And then eventually, the brainstem releases, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that states shift at the border of sleep, a slow tilting of the balance, the REM activation beginning to lose its hold, the inhibitory signal beginning to ease. The motor neuron's membrane potential drifts upward, incrementally, until the first command from the cortex that has been arriving and dissolving for minutes finally crosses the threshold and produces movement. A finger bends, or the mouth opens, or the entire body convulses with a single sharp contraction, the hypnagogic jerk that signals the release of the system, the sudden flooding of motor access into limbs that had been absent. The figure in the doorway, assembled so carefully from memory and threat, and the social intelligence of the default mode network, does not linger. It was never outside the brain that made it, and when the brain that made it changes state, it goes. The weight on the chest lifts as the intercostal muscles begin to recover their tone, as the breath deepens without effort, as the body remembers its ordinary mechanics. The floating sensation of the vestibular nuclei resolves as the full sensory context of the waking environment reestablishes its authority over the internally generated signals of motion. What remains is the room, ordinary again, lit at its dawn angle, with the ceiling where it has always been, and the walls holding their familiar distance. And in the memory of the person who just lay inside that suspended state, a figure still stands at the doorway, assembled from stored images and narrative templates built by the medial prefrontal cortex out of every cultural and personal understanding of what a threatening agent looks like and does, not imagined in the dismissive sense of the word, not invented out of nothing by a mind that lost its grip on reality, generated by a brain running its social and narrative machinery on internally produced input, constructing with the same care and the same materials it uses for all its constructions the most coherent explanation available for an experience that had no ordinary explanation. The dream brain populates the real room. It does not do so carelessly or randomly. It selects from what it knows, from what the particular mind that carries it has learned about agents and intentions and the specific shapes that threat takes. It builds to fit the space, the actual ceiling, the actual angle of the window, the actual corner where the figure stands. And when it is finished, when the construction is complete and the state that enabled it has dissolved back into ordinary waking, what it has built carries the full weight of a memory because it was built with the full resources of a brain that was in every functional sense awake. This is what the locked brain sees. Not absence, not static, not the blankness of a mind that has gone offline. A brain at the intersection of its own states, running its most sophisticated machinery on the only material available to it, its own stored knowledge of a world full of presences that move and intend and enter rooms, sees precisely what it has learned across a whole life to expect. The EEG trace on the screen in the sleep laboratory finally settles into a single signature, clean and unhurried and all waking. Outside the window of the building, the first light has arrived in the sky. The person on the narrow bed lies still for a moment longer, breathing deeply now. The figure at the door already fading into the space between memory and dream, where such things live, assembled from the brain's own architecture, as real as anything the brain has ever made, and like everything the dreaming mind constructs, already quietly dissolving in the ordinary light. After several nights of shortened sleep, the brain does not simply return to its ordinary rhythms when rest finally comes. Something different happens. In the late hours of a recovery night, when the body has been still long enough and the homeostatic pressure of accumulated wakefulness has begun to release, the architecture of sleep shifts in ways that can be measured, traced, and understood. REM sleep arrives earlier than it should. It extends further into the cycle than it ordinarily would, and it presses harder against the boundary that separates it from waking consciousness, the way water rises in a vessel that has been sealed and then slowly tilted. The mechanism behind this is not complicated, though its effects are far-reaching. During any period of insufficient sleep, a chemical accounting accumulates in the brain. The systems that ordinarily regulate the timing and depth of REM sleep are calibrated to a full night's cycle. When that cycle is cut short, they do not simply reset at the next opportunity, they compensate. The REM pressure that went unfulfilled carries forward into the next sleep period as a kind of neurological debt, and the brain moves to settle it quickly, pushing into REM earlier in the night and sustaining it longer than the normal architecture would allow. Sleep scientists call this REM rebound, and it is one of the most reliably observed effects of sleep restriction in the laboratory. It is also one of the most reliably established pathways into sleep paralysis. In the ordinary architecture of a full and uninterrupted night, the first REM period arrives roughly an hour and a half after sleep onset. It is brief, lasting perhaps 10 or 15 minutes, and the transition out of it into the next stage of sleep is clean and rapid. But in the architecture of a recovery night, the night that follows 2 or 3 nights of shortened or broken sleep, this timing collapses inward. REM begins earlier. The first period lasts longer, and critically, the periods that fall in the final hours before waking, which are already the richest and most intense REM episodes of any ordinary night, become denser still, pressing with greater force against the waking threshold and increasing the probability that the boundary between the two states will momentarily fail. When it does, consciousness assembles itself on one side of the border, while the atonia machinery responsible for paralysis continues its steady operation on the other, and the result is a body that is awake and immobile at the same time. This is why the experience so often arrives in the early morning rather than the depths of the night. The hours between 4 and 6 in the morning carry the highest density of REM sleep in an ordinary cycle. They carry an even higher density in a sleep-deprived one. A person who has slept poorly for several consecutive nights and then finally surrenders to a long and unguarded recovery sleep is entering those final hours with a nervous system that has stacked its REM pressure high, released it in full, and is now cycling through its most intense episodes at exactly the time of day when external stimuli, light beginning to filter through a curtain, a sound from an adjacent room, the slow return of daytime alertness, are most likely to pull the cortex toward waking. The cortex responds to those signals. The brainstem, deep in its REM cycle, does not respond as quickly. The gap between those two response times is where sleep paralysis lives. A person lying on their back in those early morning hours occupies a precise convergence of conditions. The night's homeostatic sleep pressure has largely been satisfied, which means the brain is no longer holding itself in deep unconsciousness with the same force it applies in the first few hours. The cortex is drifting closer to its waking threshold with each passing minute, but the brainstem has entered one of the night's richest REM periods, and the inhibitory system, responsible for atonia, the cascade that runs from the dorsal brainstem down through the ventromedial medulla to the spinal motor neurons, is running at full intensity, holding every skeletal muscle in a state of biochemical silence. The brain above and the brainstem below are operating on different schedules. The cortex wakes a few seconds or minutes before the brainstem releases its signal, and in that interval, a consciousness comes fully online inside a body it cannot move. The supine sleeping position is not incidental to this picture. Across multiple studies and in different populations, lying on the back is consistently associated with higher rates of sleep paralysis compared to sleeping on the side or face down. Several explanations have been proposed, and they are not mutually exclusive. When the body lies supine, the weight of the soft tissues of the throat and upper airway creates slightly increased resistance to breathing, which in turn can produce a mild elevation in carbon dioxide levels in the blood. This mild hypercapnia is enough to trigger a partial arousal signal, the brain sensing that something in the body's chemistry is slightly off and beginning the process of waking without necessarily completing that waking. The result is an intermediate state, a state of partial arousal that hovers between sleep and full consciousness rather than tipping cleanly into either. It is precisely in this intermediate territory that the conditions for sleep paralysis are most favorable. There is also the simpler mechanical fact that the supine position amplifies the sensation of chest pressure. When atonia acts on the intercostal muscles, the rib cage holds its position, and the ordinary work of expanding the lungs requires a muscular effort that the sleeping body cannot fully deliver. In a person lying on their back, gravity presses the chest downward and the contents of the abdomen upward against the diaphragm, adding a subtle but real additional load to the already constrained respiratory effort. The sensation this produces of weight, of constriction, of being held down is real and measurable in its physiological origins, even as the mind begins to construct explanations for it that reach far beyond physiology. The supine position is not necessary for sleep paralysis to occur, but it is, in the body's own mechanical language, a posture that favors it. The population that experiences sleep paralysis most frequently is not the population that would be easiest to predict. A survey of college students reveals rates that can reach almost 1 in 3, a figure that at first seems improbably high for something that is not classified as a disorder. The explanation lies in the specific convergence of circumstances that characterize early adult life in a modern educational setting: chronically shortened sleep from late nights and early obligations, irregular schedules that desynchronize the circadian clock and fragment sleep architecture, and the physiological reality that the brain in the late teens and early 20s is still developing its sleep regulatory machinery and may be particularly susceptible to boundary instability at sleep-wake transitions. Among general population samples, the lifetime prevalence of at least one sleep paralysis episode runs somewhere between 7 and 8%, a figure that makes it far more common than many conditions that occupy much larger space in public consciousness. The figure rises sharply in clinical populations. Among people hospitalized with psychiatric conditions, prevalence estimates in some samples reach between 30 and 35%. Among people who experience chronic disruptions to sleep architecture, whether from shift work, caregiving obligations, chronic pain, or any of the many conditions that fragment or shorten sleep, the risk is considerably elevated. These numbers carry some uncertainty, recall bias, and inconsistent definitions of what counts as an episode make precise figures difficult to establish across different studies. But the general shape of the distribution is consistent. Sleep paralysis is not a rare anomaly. It is a predictable consequence of circumstances that are themselves extraordinarily common, distributed widely across a population that sleeps poorly, sleeps irregularly, and carries the consequences of that into the architecture of every night that follows. There is one neurological condition in which sleep paralysis is not an occasional consequence of poor sleep, but a near constant feature of daily life. Narcolepsy type 1 is defined by the degeneration of a small population of neurons in the lateral hypothalamus that produce a neuropeptide called hypocretin, sometimes also known as orexin. These neurons and the signaling molecule they release serve a specific and essential function in the architecture of sleep and wakefulness. The brain moves between sleep stages and between sleep and waking through a system of competing and mutually inhibiting circuits, sometimes described as a flip-flop switch. On one side of the switch are the circuits that promote wakefulness, on the other are the circuits that promote sleep. In the ordinary brain, hypocretin acts as a stabilizing influence on this system. It does not simply push the switch toward waking. It holds the switch firmly in whichever position it is currently occupying, damping the oscillations that would otherwise cause the brain to drift unpredictably between states. When hypocretin signaling is lost, the stabilizer is gone, the flip-flop switch is no longer held firmly in place. The brain oscillates between states more freely, more rapidly, and less predictably than it should. Wakefulness intrudes into sleep. Sleep intrudes into wakefulness. And most relevant here, the specific features of REM sleep, the vivid dreaming, the dreamlike hallucinations, and above all the muscle atonia, are no longer reliably contained within the REM periods where they belong. They surface at irregular moments throughout the day and night, seeping through boundaries that hypocretin would ordinarily hold closed. For a person with narcolepsy type 1, sleep paralysis is not confined to the transition out of an early morning REM period. It can arrive at sleep onset, where the brain slips directly into REM rather than descending through the normal stages first, producing hypnagogic episodes in which the atonia of REM catches the person before their waking consciousness has fully relinquished its hold. It can arrive at any moment of extreme sleepiness, when the drowsy brain lapses briefly through a sleep-wake boundary that has no stable edge. The experience of living with narcolepsy includes the experience of a body that cannot be fully trusted to stay in the state that circumstances require, a body that may, at any moment, partially or briefly enter the atonia that most people only encounter for seconds at the edge of a dream. What narcolepsy reveals, in its stark clinical picture, is the same thing that milder sleep paralysis cases reveal in quieter terms, that the boundary between REM sleep and waking consciousness is not a fixed anatomical divide, but a dynamically maintained state, actively held in place by neurological systems that can be destabilized by sleep loss, irregular rhythms, and the absence of specific signaling molecules. The boundary is not a wall. It is more like a surface tension, maintained by steady underlying processes, capable of being disrupted when those processes are strained. Among the conditions that most reliably strain it, anxiety sits alongside sleep deprivation as one of the clearest and most thoroughly documented. Post-traumatic stress disorder produces elevated rates of sleep paralysis through a relationship that operates in both directions. In the daytime, the nervous system of a person living with post-traumatic stress disorder maintains a level of amygdala activation and threat detection readiness that is calibrated for an environment of ongoing danger. This calibration does not switch off at sleep onset. It persists into the night, shaping the architecture of sleep from the inside. The REM sleep of a person with post-traumatic stress disorder is often fragmented, frequently interrupted by arousal signals, and organized around a pattern in which REM-dominant sleep is both more frequent and less stable than in the ordinary sleeper. The amygdala that scans for threat during waking hours continues to scan during REM. The system that holds the sleep-wake boundary closed is working against a nervous system that is primed for rapid arousal, and the boundary fails more often as a result. Each failure, each episode of sleep paralysis, then feeds back into the anxiety that generated the fragmented sleep in the first place. The experience of waking immobile, with full consciousness, but no ability to move or call out, is for most people deeply unsettling. For a person whose nervous system is already tuned to interpret ambiguous situations as threats, the experience can be profoundly disturbing in ways that extend well beyond the episode itself. The night becomes a place of anticipated danger. The anticipatory anxiety around sleep increases. Falling asleep becomes harder, and the sleep that does come is lighter, more easily interrupted, richer in the early and unstable RM that is most prone to producing paralysis. The architecture worsens, the episodes become more frequent, and the cycle, already set in motion by the original trauma and its aftermath, deepens. This bidirectional relationship between anxiety and sleep paralysis is not unique to post-traumatic stress disorder. Generalized anxiety disorder and panic disorder both show elevated rates of sleep paralysis in population studies through mechanisms that likely share the same core features. A chronically activated threat detection system that disrupts sleep architecture, a sleep architecture prone to fragmented and unstable REM, and an experience of paralysis that amplifies rather than resolves the underlying anxiety. The body and the mind are not working against each other in this cycle. They are both responding with complete internal logic to the conditions they find themselves in. The amygdala is doing exactly what it was built to do. The sleep stage boundary is doing exactly what boundary systems do under stress. The result is a cycle that is painful and self-reinforcing, but not mysterious. The pattern extends across other forms of anxiety and chronic stress in ways that research is still mapping. People who sleep in irregular schedules, who work shifts that rotate across day and night, who cross multiple time zones frequently, or whose caregiving responsibilities fragment sleep across the night, show elevated rates of sleep paralysis even in the absence of a diagnosable anxiety disorder. The common element is not the anxiety itself, but what anxiety and schedule disruption both produce. A sleep architecture in which the ordinary sequence of sleep stages is disturbed, in which the boundary between RM and waking is less firmly maintained, and in which the specific conditions that allow atonia to persist into waking consciousness occur more frequently. There is a quality to the early morning hours that sleep researchers who work with these populations come to know well. It is the quality of a nervous system that has traveled through its full night of sleep, arrived at the final hours of its RM-rich late cycle, and now hovers in a state of readiness that is neither fully asleep nor fully awake. The body is still, the breath is shallow and rapid in the RM rhythm. The eyes, beneath their closed lids, are moving, and somewhere in the brain's layered architecture, the cortex is beginning to stir, while the brainstem, deep in its atonic work, has not yet received the signal that the night is ending. This is the state that sleep deprivation pushes harder toward and more frequently into. After several consecutive nights of sleeping 5 or 6 hours when 8 are needed, the accumulated deficit of RM sleep transforms this ordinary late morning hover into something more precarious. The RM periods are denser, the atonia signal is stronger, and the cortex, nudged by light or sound, or simply by the rising pressure of daytime alertness, tips toward waking more readily than the brainstem can follow. The gap opens, consciousness returns, and the body, still held by its inhibitory machinery, does not. It is worth sitting with the arithmetic of this for a moment, because it reveals how ordinary and how pervasive the conditions for sleep paralysis actually are. A student who sleeps 6 hours on weeknights and attempts to recover on weekends is running exactly the kind of cycle most likely to produce RM rebound. A shift worker whose schedule rotates between day and night shifts is living inside a chronically desynchronized circadian rhythm that fragments sleep architecture in precisely the way that destabilizes RM-wake boundaries. An anxious person whose amygdala keeps sleep lightly, close to the surface, is sleeping in the architecture most prone to the partial arousals that allow atonia to carry forward into consciousness. None of these people are rare. All of them are describing the ordinary texture of modern sleep in a working population. The lifetime prevalence figure of roughly 7 to 8%, for all that it is complicated by definition differences and recall bias, represents tens of millions of people in any large country alone. The higher figures seen in student populations, approaching 1 in 3 in some surveys, suggest that the phenomenon may be experienced at some point during early adulthood by a far larger proportion of the population than the lifetime prevalence figure implies. Most of these episodes are brief. Most are not reported to a doctor. Many are not recognized for what they are and are filed away as strange experiences, vivid nightmares, or something not quite either, for which the person has no ready vocabulary. This is part of what makes the epidemiology of sleep paralysis difficult to map precisely. The experience is common enough to have been named in nearly every human culture that has left a record, but it is not common enough and not well enough recognized in most of the populations that experience it to be systematically counted. People do not typically tell their physicians that they woke unable to move and felt a presence in the room. They may mention it in passing or not at all. The surveys that capture it depend on asking the right questions in the right way, and the answers they receive are shaped by how well the person remembers an episode that was frightening but brief, and by whether the vocabulary available to them allows them to recognize and name what happened. What is clear beneath these complications is the shape of the distribution. Sleep paralysis is most likely to occur at the intersection of 3 conditions: a sleep architecture that is rich in and pressed toward REM, a sleep-wake boundary that is unstable or under strain, and a moment of partial arousal that brings the cortex toward waking faster than the brainstem can follow. Sleep deprivation creates the first condition directly. The supine sleeping position sustains the second. Anxiety and trauma shape the architecture in ways that create both. And narcolepsy, at its most extreme, eliminates the mechanism that holds the boundary stable at all times, making sleep paralysis not a risk, but a near certainty. In the laboratory, when researchers monitor the brain states of individuals who report frequent sleep paralysis, what they find is consistent with this picture. The recordings show a brain in transition, not cleanly in one state or another, but occupying a hybrid position that carries the electrical signatures of 2 states at once. The slow waves and alpha rhythms that mark light waking coexist with the theta rhythms and neural activation patterns of REM. The atonia machinery is running. The cortex is responsive. The 2 systems are temporarily out of phase with each other, each continuing its own characteristic activity as if the other were not present, and consciousness is threading through the gap between them. What determines whether this hybrid state produces an episode of sleep paralysis, and not simply a brief moment of drowsiness or a half-remembered fragment of a dream, is partly the depth of the dissociation between the 2 systems, and partly the speed at which the cortex completes its arousal. Off the brainstem releases its atonia signal quickly. Within a few seconds of the cortex beginning to wake, the person may not notice anything unusual at all, or may notice only a brief heaviness in the limbs before full voluntary movement returns. If the release is slower, if the cortex completes its waking while the brainstem maintains its inhibitory output, the person finds themselves fully conscious and fully paralyzed. And the experience unfolds from there in whatever direction the nervous system's specific state and the body's specific position and the history that person brings into the night will take it. For a person with no prior history of sleep paralysis, the first episode can be deeply disorienting. For a person who has experienced it multiple times, it may still be frightening, or it may have become, with familiarity, something more complex, a recognizable state, strange and uncomfortable, but not entirely unknown, with a beginning, a middle, and an end that has always eventually come. The brain that has learned to recognize sleep paralysis from the inside is not a different brain anatomically from the one that experienced it with no frame of reference. It is simply a brain that has attached a category to an unusual experience, which is one of the things brains do best, and which can, in this particular case, make a real difference to how the body responds to the state it finds itself in. The people most vulnerable to frequent episodes and to the most distressing episodes are often those whose sleep is under the most sustained pressure. A student working through a period of intense academic demand, sleeping 5 hours on weekdays and trying to recover on weekends, is not doing anything unusual by contemporary standards. Neither is the emergency worker whose shift schedule rotates through the calendar in a pattern that the circadian clock was never designed to accommodate. Neither is the person who has been carrying anxiety for months, anxiety about work, about money, about relationships, about any of the ordinary and relentless demands of a working life, and who brings that anxiety into bed each night as an invisible companion that keeps the sleep lightly poised and the amygdala quietly active through the small hours. These are not profiles of exceptional vulnerability. They are the ordinary conditions of a very large number of ordinary lives, and the sleep that these conditions produce, fragmented, REM-pressured, boundary unstable, is the sleep that most reliably creates the gaps through which atonia carries forward into waking. The brain is not malfunctioning in any final or categorical sense. It is responding with precise logic to conditions that destabilize a boundary that was already, in every human brain, maintained by active and effortful neurological processes, rather than by any fixed or permanent anatomical structure. There is something almost clarifying in this picture, once it is seen whole. Sleep paralysis does not arrive at random. It does not select its subjects arbitrarily or through any individual weakness. It arrives where the conditions invite it, in brains that are tired or anxious or sleep irregular or neurologically primed by hypocretin deficiency to lose their state boundaries more easily than others. It arrives in the bodies that are positioned to sustain the arousal without release that the supine posture promotes. It arrives in the hours when the architecture of REM is richest and the pressure toward waking is beginning to build. And in those convergent conditions, which are not rare or exotic, but woven into the daily fabric of how many people live, the nervous system does what nervous systems do when their ordinarily distinct states are asked to occupy the same moment. It holds both at once, as long as it can. The holding does not last long. Episodes are brief, measured in minutes at most, and they end the same way they began, through a shift in the balance between the two systems that are temporarily overlapping. A sound from outside the room, or the touch of another body against the arm, or simply the natural progression of the brain's own state-switching machinery, tips the balance back toward full wakefulness, and the atonia signal withdraws. Or the REM cycle completes on its own terms, and the brainstem releases the motor neurons, and the atonia dissolves without any external help at all. The body returns to itself. The muscles answer again. The boundary that had been open for a moment closes. What the episode leaves behind, in a person who does not understand what has happened, is often more disturbing than the episode itself. The memory is vivid. Consciousness during sleep paralysis is fully intact, and the experience is recorded with the same clarity as any waking memory, and the memory may carry a weight of fear or strangeness that lingers into the following day and into the following night. The anticipatory anxiety this generates can begin to shape the next night's sleep, tipping the architecture in the direction of fragmentation and instability. And so the conditions that produce the first episode are quietly reinforced by the experience of it. But the mechanism itself, taken apart and examined in the clean light of what is understood about how it works, is not a malfunction in any pathological sense. It is a failure of timing. It is the atonia system, which is, under ordinary REM sleep conditions, an elegant and functionally essential process, the thing that keeps a sleeping person still while their dreaming brain rehearses movement and action and the whole rich theater of sleep, persisting for a few additional seconds or minutes into a consciousness that is already present and waiting for the body to resume. The brainstem is doing what it always does in REM sleep. The cortex is doing what it does when the morning comes, or when a sound or a change in light tips it toward waking. The two systems are simply not synchronized in that particular moment, in that particular person, on that particular night. And the window of their desynchrony, brief, measurable, explained by the same principles that govern every other aspect of how the sleeping brain transitions between its states, is what sleep paralysis is. Somewhere in the late morning architecture of a sleep-deprived night, in the body of a student or a shift worker or a person who has carried anxiety through too many consecutive weeks without relief. The final rich REM period of the night presses hard against the waking threshold, while the light is beginning at the edges of the curtain. The cortex stirs. The brainstem holds. The atonia signal runs its steady current down through the medulla to the motor neurons of the arms and the legs and the chest, and the muscles receive it and remain still, as they have been still all night, as they would remain still for another few minutes if nothing had disturbed the balance. But something has. The cortex has crossed the threshold into waking, while the brainstem has not yet followed, and a consciousness, complete and present, opens inside a body that is being held exactly as carefully and exactly as precisely as it has been held since the moment of REM onset. The holding is not an accident. It is not a disease. It is the atonia system doing its work a little longer than the waking system wanted it to, in those few still minutes before the brainstem releases its signal and the body comes back under the direction of a fully awakened brain. The two most ancient systems of the nervous system are briefly visible to each other across their ordinary divide, the one that dreams and the one that wakes, occupying the same body at the same time, each continuing its own careful work as if the other had not arrived. And then one of them yields, as one always does, and the muscles answer, and the morning comes, and the body rises, carrying the memory of a few strange moments when the night was not quite finished, and the day had already begun, and the space between them was briefly and completely inhabited. In the autumn of 1971, a folklorist named David Hufford arrived in Newfoundland, carrying a set of questions about folk belief and supernatural tradition. He had come expecting to document stories, the kinds of inherited narratives that communities pass down through families and across generations, stories that people know to be stories that belong to the fabric of a culture the way a particular song belongs to a particular place. What he found instead was something that did not fit that frame at all. What he found were first-person accounts, the fishing communities of the island described, with a consistency that resisted easy explanation, a nocturnal experience that most had never spoken about to anyone outside their immediate families. They called it the Old Hag, and they described it in the same terms, again and again, with the same sequence of events in the same order, using the same quiet vocabulary of something that had happened to them personally, not something they had heard or inherited. Waking in the dark, the body refusing to move, a weight or a presence arriving, uninvited, into the space around the bed, the chest pressed down, the voice silenced before it could form. Hufford listened. He took careful notes. And somewhere in the accumulation of those independent testimonies, each one consistent with the others, in ways that could not be explained by social rehearsal or shared storytelling tradition, he recognized that these people were not describing a myth. They were describing an experience. The same experience, arriving through the same body, night after night across generations, dressed in the local language of their particular island, but structured by something older and more universal than any language. The old hag of Newfoundland was not a story that had traveled. It was a pattern the nervous system had generated and the community had named. That recognition, that particular quality of scholarly stillness that arrives when the evidence refuses to be organized into the expected category, shaped the argument Hufford published a decade later, in a study that would quietly alter the way scientists and folklorists thought about the relationship between human experience and human belief. His central claim was careful and specific. He was not arguing that supernatural entities were real. He was arguing that the experiences people reported as supernatural encounters were real experiences generated from the inside by a body and a brain moving through a state that produces specific, consistent, and verifiable perceptual content. The demon was not transmitted by culture. The demon was built by the brainstem, and every culture that had produced one had built it independently from the same raw material with the same essential structure, because the raw material was the same everywhere, because the human brain is the same everywhere. The Newfoundland community gave Hufford a name. It gave him a living tradition, still generating new cases, still producing new first-person witnesses who had not heard the term old hag before their own experience led them to it. And in that living tradition, he found the evidence for an argument that the most extraordinary aspect of sleep paralysis is not the experience itself, but what the experience reveals about the relationship between the brain and the stories the brain tells to make sense of itself. There is a word in Turkish, karabasan. It translates roughly and with no loss of accuracy as the dark presser. It is an old word belonging to a folk tradition that has named and described its nocturnal visitor for longer than any written record can confirm. The name is not incidental. The name is a compression, 2 syllables of folk etymology that encode the entire phenomenology of an episode with a precision that would not embarrass a clinical description. Dark because it comes in the absence of light, in the hours when the body is at its most undefended. Presser because the defining feature, the thing that survivors reach for first when they try to describe it, is the weight, the sensation of something pressing on the chest from above, from outside, with a force that the rib cage cannot counter and the lungs cannot relieve by drawing a deeper breath. The Carabasan is not a story imported from somewhere else. It is not a figure who arrived in central Anatolia aboard a caravan of borrowed mythology. It appears in the Arabic tradition as the jinn who settles on a sleeping body in the hours before dawn. It appears in Persian as the Baktak, the night crusher, another compression of the same essential features into a proper noun across Central Asia and into the shamanic traditions of the steppe. Similar entities appear with similar names and similar behaviors, arriving uninvited, pressing the body, silencing the voice, departing before the sleeper can fully account for what happened. Each one arrived in its own language. Each one was given its own specific character, its own cultural clothing, its own place in the local cosmology of night and danger, and the boundaries between the living and whatever lies beyond them. But underneath each one, beneath the different names and the different metaphysics, the structure was identical, because the structure was not cultural. The structure was neurological. In the late 18th century, in a London studio, a painter named Henry Fuseli stood before a canvas and produced what would become one of the most discussed images in the history of Western art. The painting, completed in 1781 and exhibited the following year, shows a woman lying supine across a draped surface, her head and arms falling back in the particular loose descent of a body in deep sleep. On her chest, crouching with the comfortable authority of something that belongs there, sits a small and heavy figure, a goblin, an incubus, a presence with the weight of intention concentrated entirely in its posture. Behind her, through parted curtains at the edge of the frame, a horse's head emerges with wide and unseeing eyes, pale against the amber dark of the room. The painting was an immediate sensation. It was copied, parodied, reprinted across Europe, and it became one of those cultural objects that appears to touch something that a broad audience already knows without knowing that it knows it. For 2 centuries, art historians described it as an allegory of erotic anxiety, as a commentary on the fears of female embodiment, as a Gothic fever dream produced by a singular and overheated imagination. Sleep scientists, looking at the same canvas much later, described something different. They found in the goblin's posture and placement its weight distributed precisely across the sternum, its presence undeniable but not fully resolved into ordinary visible form, a near clinical illustration of the incubus hallucination. They found in the horse's emerging head, its eyes carrying the quality of something glimpsed in peripheral vision during a state of incomplete waking, a plausible rendering of the kind of visual intrusion that accompanies the hybrid REM-wake brain state. They found, in short, evidence that sleep paralysis was common enough in 18th century London to constitute an immediately recognizable cultural image, something a painter could render in oil and expect an audience to feel, to recognize, to understand from the inside, before any of them had a name for the neurological event that lay beneath the recognition. Fuseli never used the word sleep paralysis. The words did not exist, but the experience he painted had been happening to human beings for as long as human beings had been sleeping, and it had been happening long enough and consistently enough that an artist could make of it a cultural reference point, a shared image, a thing that needed no explanation, because the explanation was already inside the people who looked at it. Across the Atlantic, and several decades after Fuseli set down his brushes, in the communities of West Africa and in the diaspora populations of the Caribbean and Brazil that carried West African tradition across the ocean, the same experience was being organized into a different explanatory framework. Among the Yoruba and related traditions, what happened in the night, the waking paralysis, the felt presence, the impossible wait, was understood as a form of nocturnal spiritual visitation, a category of experience with its own name and its own place in the theology of the community. The Ogun Oru tradition did not require the experience to be unusual or exceptional. It expected it. It had prepared for it. It had built around the experience a structure of meaning that gave the person who woke in the dark, unable to move, with something pressing on their chest, that gave that person a framework, an explanation, a vocabulary for what had happened, and a community of others for whom the same thing had happened and been understood. Researchers studying the psychological aftermath of sleep paralysis across different cultural contexts have found something worth considering with care. Individuals whose cultural background provides a validated explanatory framework for the nocturnal episode, a supernatural tradition that names and accounts for what happened, that places it in a larger cosmological story, may experience measurably less lasting distress from their episodes than individuals who encounter the same symptoms in secular Western contexts that offer no such framework. The experience is the same. The brain generates the same hybrid state, the same atonia, the same felt presence, but the meaning available to the experiencer differs, and that difference in available meaning appears to alter the experience's psychological residue in ways that are not trivial. This is not an argument that the supernatural framework is more accurate. It is an observation about what the mind does with an experience it cannot otherwise organize. The experience needs a story. The brain, having generated something it cannot explain in ordinary terms, reaches for the nearest coherent narrative that can hold it. In a community where the nearest coherent narrative is a tradition of nocturnal spiritual visitation with centuries of precedent and communal validation, the narrative fits. The episode is absorbed. In a community where no such narrative exists, where the nearest available framework is the private suspicion that something is deeply wrong with the body that just did this, the experience may not be absorbed so easily. It may circle, it may compound. The Carabasan and the Ogun Oru and the Old Hag of Newfoundland are not, in this reading, errors. They are solutions. They are what the mind builds when the brain generates an experience that exceeds the ordinary categories of waking life, and the mind must find somewhere to put it. In Scandinavia, the figure has been known for centuries by the name Mara, a word that passed into English as the second half of nightmare and carried with it the precise etiology embedded in its original meaning. The Mara was understood to sit on the sleeping body, to press, to suffocate, to silence. The word and the concept traveled into German and Dutch and across the medieval Germanic world, adapting as it went to local cosmologies while retaining the structural core, the weight, the presence, the impossibility of crying out. The nightmare was not, in its original use, a frightening dream. It was a frightening visitor. The dream framing came later as the cultural understanding of the experience shifted. The entity came first. In Japan, the experience is known as kanashibari, a word that translates as bound in metal or fastened with iron. The image is instructive. Not pressed, not visited, but bound. The body held from within as much as from without, constrained by something the culture located in the domain of spirits and the restless dead, but that the body's own inhibitory chemistry is now understood to produce. In the sleep laboratories of Kyoto and Tokyo, researchers studying kanashibari have found the same brain signatures found in studies of sleep paralysis in North America and Europe, the same waking cortical rhythms coexisting with the same REM-driven suppression of voluntary movement, the same hybrid state running its course across the same duration. The cultural name differs, the mechanism does not. In South America, a figure called the Pisadera moves across the rooftops at night, heavy-footed, descending to the chests of those who have eaten too much and slept too soon after eating. The Cambodian tradition holds the Kamoch Sangkot, the ghost who sits, and the specific features of its arrival. The paralysis, the presence, the weight on the sternum match the features documented in clinical descriptions with a precision that leaves little room for coincidence. These are not borrowed stories. Cambodia and Brazil and Norway share no common mythology. They share a common brainstem. The researcher Beland Jalal and colleagues, examining the global distribution of sleep paralysis entities across cultures with no documented historical contact with one another, have used this convergence as evidence for a specific and careful argument. The argument is not that all cultures have been telling the same story. The argument is that all cultures have been having the same experience and finding it necessary to explain. The brain generates a specific experiential signature, the paralysis, the felt presence, the respiratory restriction, the hallucinated agent, and that signature is sufficiently consistent across individual nervous systems that every human community in which enough people experience it eventually arrives at a proper noun for the entity that generated it. Not the experience, the entity, because the experience arrives already equipped with a sense of agency, already structured as an encounter with something outside the self, already presenting itself in the grammar of visitation rather than the grammar of malfunction. The brain builds the demon, the culture names it. What the global map of sleep paralysis entities reveals, plotted across every inhabited continent in cultures with no shared history and no shared mythology, is not a migration of stories. Stories migrate. Trade routes and conquest and the movement of populations carry stories from one language to another, and the stories change as they travel, absorbing the local landscape, the local fears, the local theology. The old hag does not travel in caravans. The mara does not cross oceans. What crosses oceans is the genome, and inside the genome is the same brainstem in every body, and inside the brainstem is the same sublater dorsal nucleus, and inside the same sublater dorsal nucleus is the same inhibitory signal, waiting for the onset of REM sleep to activate, waiting for the particular misalignment of cortical waking and brainstem inhibition to produce the same experience in the same sequence, in the same quality of darkness. The distribution of sleep paralysis entities is a distribution of brains. It is a map of the nervous system drawn in folklore. One entity per culture, each entity independently generated by the same raw material, each community of sleeping minds independently compelled to explain what had happened to them in the night, and independently arriving at the same structural solution, a being with weight, with presence, and with apparent intention, arriving uninvited and departing before the sleeper could fully account for it. There is something slow and wide in that recognition. It opens outward rather than narrowing, because what it describes is not the strangeness of human superstition or the gullibility of pre-scientific communities who had not yet learned to distinguish hallucination from reality. What it describes is the consistency of the human brain across all the variations of history and geography and culture that seem from the surface to separate one community of people from another. Beneath those variations, the same thing happens. The brainstem activates its inhibitory signal. The cortex surfaces toward waking. The two states coexist for a duration that can be measured in seconds, though it rarely feels that brief. And the mind, conscious and intact and unable to move, assembles from the available material, from the patterns the threat detection systems have already flagged, from the stored architecture of what a dangerous presence feels like, from the learned grammar of agents and intentions that social cognition applies automatically to any ambiguous sensory input, assembles a visitor. The visitor is not imported from outside. The visitor is constructed from within. And the remarkable thing, the thing that Hufford recognized in those Newfoundland testimonies, and that the global distribution of entity traditions confirms, is that the construction is consistent enough across individual minds and cultural contexts that it keeps producing the same basic figure, something heavy, something present, something that intends. In the sleep laboratory, the EEG trace that captures a sleep paralysis episode shows two electrical signatures occupying the same time and the same skull. The waking alpha rhythms run their steady frequency across the cortical channels. Beneath them, or threaded through them, the slower theta rhythms of active REM dreaming persist, driven from lower in the brainstem, maintaining the inhibitory tone that holds the body still. A researcher looking at that trace from the outside sees a measurement, a scientific artifact, a pattern of voltage fluctuations recorded across metal contacts on a shaved scalp. The person generating that trace from the inside experiences a visitor in a dark room. Both descriptions are accurate. Neither one is complete without the other. The trace without the testimony is a curiosity. The testimony without the trace is a ghost story. Together, they are a portrait of a human brain doing something it was built to do, at a moment when two of its regular processes have failed to disengage from each other cleanly. The inhibitory signal that holds the body still during REM sleep is not an error. It is in the ordinary course of a sleeping night, one of the body's more elegant provisions, the mechanism that prevents a dreaming person from acting out the movements of the dream, that keeps the sleeping body still and safe while the mind moves through landscapes that have no floor and no ceiling and no obligation to obey physical law. The signal fails to disengage, sometimes. The cortex surfaces from sleep, while the brainstem holds its inhibitory tone a little longer than the transition requires. The result is a state that has no ordinary name in waking life, because waking life does not ordinarily produce it. A state of full consciousness inside a body that cannot be reached from the inside. Every culture that has produced a name for the entity that seems to cause this state has been, in its own terms, correct. Something did arrive. Something did press on the chest. Something did silence the voice and hold the body in place and depart before its nature could be confirmed. The culture supplied the explanation for what that something was. The brain supplied the something itself, working from its own materials, following its own logic, producing in the darkness of the sleeping room a presence as convincing as any presence that has ever occupied a room in waking life, because the brain that builds waking experience and the brain that builds the sleep paralysis visitor are the same brain, using the same architecture, applying the same perceptual confidence to two very different kinds of input. The Mara sat on 10,000 Scandinavian chests in 10,000 winter nights before anyone documented it. The Carabasan pressed on 10,000 sleeping bodies in the inland valleys of Anatolia before it acquired a proper noun. The old hag visited the fishing communities of the North Atlantic coast through generations of families who never connected their private experience to the private experiences of their neighbors until a folklorist from Pennsylvania came and asked them, carefully, to describe what had happened to them in the night. And when they described it separately, privately, in the particular cadences of their own fishing community English, without any suggestion from Hufford of what the description ought to contain, they produced accounts that were, in their essential structure, the same account. Not because they had heard each other's stories, because they had been through each other's experience. That is the thing the global record of sleep paralysis entities confirms, repeated in language after language, in naming tradition after naming tradition, across the full span of human history, for which written records exist, and likely far beyond it. The experience is universal. The need to explain it is universal. The explanatory structure that the mind arrives at, a being with weight and presence and intention, is, if not precisely universal, distributed so widely across the human world that its absence in any cultural record is harder to explain than its presence. The demon is not an error in the system. The demon is what the system looks like from the inside, at the moment when the system is briefly doing two things at once that it was not designed to do simultaneously: waking and sleeping, perceiving and dreaming, conscious and inhibited, and the mind, because it is a mind, and cannot do otherwise, because making sense of experience is what a mind is for, reaches into its deepest stores of pattern and narrative, and threat detection and cultural knowledge, and builds from those materials the most coherent account it can of what is pressing on the chest in the dark. That account is a figure. That figure has weight. It has presence. It has in the particular quality of the encounter something that feels very much like intention, and from the moment it arrives until the moment the inhibitory signal finally releases its hold and the body becomes reachable again, the figure is as real as anything the waking world has ever offered, because the brain that is perceiving it is a waking brain running its full perceptual capacity, applying its full confidence to the signal it is receiving, and the signal it is receiving is being generated by the same dreaming machinery that makes everything in a dream feel absolutely, completely, undeniably real. In the morning, the sleeper wakes fully, the body answers, the room is ordinary, the weight is gone. The presence that had seemed so certain dissolves back into the familiar geometry of a ceiling, a window, a floor covered in ordinary light. And the person who experienced it, whether they call it the old hag, or the Karabasan, or the Kanashibari, or nothing at all, whether they reach for a supernatural explanation or a medical one, or simply hold the memory of it quietly and do not speak of it to anyone, that person carries in their body the same nervous system that has generated this experience in every inhabited place the human animal has ever slept. The inhibitory neurons in the brainstem do not know which culture produced the person they inhabit. They do not know which language the person speaks, or which name their tradition has given to what the brainstem is about to produce. They know only their own chemistry, the glycine and the GABA, the hyperpolarized motor neurons, the descending signal that holds the body still through the long, strange theater of REM sleep. They do what they always do. They activate at the onset of dreaming, and they hold, and most nights they release cleanly when the sleep cycle ends, and the body wakes into full command of itself, and the night's architecture closes quietly behind it. Some nights they hold a little longer. The cortex arrives at waking first, and the brainstem catches up later, and in the interval between them, a consciousness assembles itself inside a body it cannot move, in a room it can perceive, and with a clarity that is complete, and a paralysis that is total, and a sense of presence that is as convincing as anything the waking world has ever produced. The mind does what it always does with experience it cannot otherwise organize. It builds a story. It gives the story a figure. It gives the figure weight and presence and the grammar of intention.